Hello, welcome once again, everyone, to a Climate Emergency Centre Network Wednesday webinar. We have incredible knowledge in the house tonight with Laurie Laybourn, who is an Executive Director of the Strategic Climate Risks Initiative. Laurie's worked extensively throughout this and many environmental movements and all the way up to advising Parliament and a whole range of groups. But there's a lot of knowledge there to be shared. So without too much further ado, I couldn't read out his full CV. It's quite long. Laurie, you're highly recommended, mentioned in dispatches. Over to you. Thank you very much for coming and sharing.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And thanks so much, everyone, for having me here this evening. I hope I can bring some wisdom. To be perfectly honest, I take a lot of wisdom from the groups that all of you are involved in. And it was amazing to hear there in the check-in the huge range of activism that you're all doing. And um, the job I do at the moment is to run this think tank called the Strategic Climate Risk Initiative. You know, there are some think tanks that are not so useful in our struggle against the climate and nature crisis. There are others who are trying to be a bit more useful, and that's what we've tried to create with the Strategic Climate Risk Initiative. It's a think tank for what comes next, for how we can navigate this struggle through the even worse chapter that we're about to enter into. That doesn't mean the game is up. It just means the context for our work is becoming that much more challenging. So what I'm going to do this evening is share some of our thinking at the Strategic Climate Risk Initiative on the types of the way that the challenge is evolving and our response to that, the kind of capabilities we might need as we head into this next chapter. So I spend most of my time through the Strategic Climate Risk Initiative talking to people who are more in the domain of policymaking in the context of governments, people who work for major private companies like insurers. And that work is focused on getting them to understand that we are entering what I call and what others are starting to call a new climate reality. And I will define what we mean by that, what that could then lead to, and how we might be able to navigate it. But first, I want to frame this in terms of the movement struggling against the climate and nature crisis so far, right? Here's my mood board of bits of that movement, bits that I often have some connection or engagement with. A lot of this stuff that we see here has developed over a very long time, but a lot of it developed in the context of about 0.91 degree of warming. It was in 2015, for example, when the Paris Agreement was signed, that the world hit about 1 degree centigrade of a global temperature rise. And what's happening now is we're facing a situation where we are no longer in the world of 1 degree. We are heading, of course, into a world of 1.5 degrees and above. The latest World Meteorological Organization data presented in a completely impenetrable way on this graph here basically is showing that we will definitively head over that 1.5 degree global goal within the next few years. We are bouncing above it at the moment, but it could be definitively lost by, they say, 2028. It might already have been lost. It is clear, though, that we are exiting that world in which the climate and nature movement as we know it largely emerged, or the latest version of it emerged, into then a new world. And it means that that movement is going to have to evolve. Now, side point here, I think a lot of the groups that you guys are coming from have been doing this already. So you've got to bear in mind that a lot of what I'm going to say here is largely directed to a lot of the people I engage with through my work and not necessarily to frontline campaigning, because I think a lot of these things that I'm talking about have already happened. I'm partly been inspired by some of that campaigning that I've seen. But I want to tell the story I've got to tell, and then it would be great to have a bit of discussion. So we are in this new climate reality, and we hear this all the time from, for example, climate scientists who are now using a familiar phrase over and over again. We are in uncharted territory now. We are truly in uncharted territory. And this presents a really big, I think, challenge to a lot of the mainstream climate politics, particularly climate policymaking, the domain that I have most engagement with. A lot of that work, or the way it's spoken about, the way it's configured, is similar to this image here of a ship heading towards a storm. The ship can be the world. It can be a particular country or community or a sector or a company. And the way that the challenge is often set up is that that ship, that country, that company is facing this storm, this climate crisis, this point in which we might go over 1.5 degrees. And what we've got to do is alert others on the ship that it exists so that we can then work together to change the bearing, and ultimately we'll be able to sail around and all will be well. And so much of the storytelling around climate change, the way policies are formulated, is still in that kind of binary win-lose, we can sail around or we'll be well. And of course, going over 1.5 degrees, experiencing what we're experiencing at the moment, shows that the bearing didn't change enough. It has changed. There has been extraordinary gains in cheaper renewables, for example. The very fact that these convenings happen, and that you're doing what you're doing and we meet and so on, is a sign that the bearing, this figurative bearing of the ship, has been shifting, but it's not been enough. And now, of course, we're in the storm. We're going over 1.5 degrees, worsting impacts are hitting the world. And the crucial image I want, therefore, to paint in our minds is that the type of mindset and strategy that as a sailor you need to avoid a storm is very different to the type of mindset and strategy you need when you're in a storm. Now, again, I think some of those shifts have happened in frontline campaigning. It hasn't necessarily happened in the context of policymaking, the domain I'm most familiar with. So that's the image I want us to have in our minds as I go through first what I think some of the crucial features of the storm, of the experience of being in this figurative and literal storm are, and then some of the capabilities we need to navigate in it as societies, as governments, and so on. So firstly, one of the key features of being in the storm is that things are going to basically be more extreme than we probably anticipated. This is already happening. So you don't need to read this, but it is a screenshot from the UK government's climate change risk assessment, the last one of which it released in 2022, in January 2022. And in January of that year, the risk assessment said basically that the chance of the UK experiencing a heat wave above 40 degrees, that hadn't happened yet, above 40 degrees before 2040 was 0.02%. So a tiny little chance that the UK could get a 40-degree heat wave before 2040. Within 6 months, it happened. And London experienced these huge fires that attracted a lot of media attention. So this is an example of where the things that are happening, the experience of the storm, is that impacts will be are falling at the extreme end of what was anticipated. Another feature of being in the storm is that in some cases, things will happen that are beyond even what was anticipated. So again, another impenetrable image I'm showing you here, but let me zoom in on Europe. What you see there, where you see red, dark red, basically is showing that the heat extremes experienced in the UK, in France, and other bits of Europe are even more extreme than some of the models predicted, which gives you an idea of, in this storm, more and more weird things, very unexpected things are going to start to happen. That's a key feature of here on out. Again, I don't think that that's something that you guys necessarily have missed. A second feature is that it won't just be the immediate consequences of climate change that really characterize the impacts of the experience of being in this storm, right? So the graph I'm showing you here is inflation in Britain from the beginning of 2021 all the way through to the beginning of this year. The yellow line, which rises here, reaching a peak around Christmas 2022, is overall inflation, how everything was getting more expensive. The red line is then just food and non-alcoholic beverages. And you can see there that the rise in food prices was particularly acute at that time. We now know that one of the major factors driving that was extreme weather, which itself was driven by climate change. And this heat map here shows you that in countries all across Europe, the record-breaking heat of 2022 then damaged crops, which then increased food prices, which then increased overall inflation. So often on the news, we see the immediate impacts of climate change, the storm, the fire, but it is these knock-on, these domino effects, the consequences of those immediate impacts. It is those that will really characterize, alongside the immediate impacts, our experience of being in the storm. And those knock-on consequences will also do weird stuff, counterintuitive stuff. An example of that comes from Valencia. We probably all saw the horrifying, tragic, unprecedented floods that hit the Valencia region at the end of last year, the end of October last year. One of those immediate impacts that get a lot of media attention. Now, you would think that as those impacts get worse in Valencia and other places, it will then lead to a greater succession of wake-up calls of people saying, oh, okay, wow, those campaigners were right. We need to do something about this. But in Valencia, something unexpected happened. The opposite, in fact, happened. This is a screenshot here of Santiago Abascal, who is the leader of the Vox political party, going on national television to blame, as you can see there, what he calls climate fanaticism. His story at the time was hard for us maybe to understand, but was that basically an obsession, often coming from Brussels, from the European Union, to protect the environment meant that it was protected at the expense of protecting people. Specifically in his case, that some dams had been blown up on the rivers near Valencia many years before because of some fear about it impacting nature, which then meant the water rushed quicker through the rivers. Now, there's a load of complexities there. In Spain, there's a particular connection between General Franco and dams. It's complex, but people in Spain got it. It seemed intuitive that the feckless politicians who were in charge when the disaster struck also could have been doing things that cared more for nature, for these woke issues, than protecting people from the risk that then came, which was the floods. That was basically the argument that Abascal was making. And it made sense at the time because people were looking for someone to blame. And the people in charge had messed up the response. There's this famous example where the local political leader, what they call a president at the regional level, was firstly at a lunch with a journalist as the disaster struck and didn't get involved with leading the response. And then when he finally did lead the response, he went on live television to tell people that everything had calmed down, literally as it got worse. And people were watching on television as it was getting worse. So there was a lot of people to blame. People wanted someone to blame. And Santiago Abascal harnessed that blame. And the Vox political party has since then used that increasing profile to drive its influence. And surprise, surprise, Vox is all about trying to undo climate action. And so one of the knock-on consequences that could increasingly be a part of our experience of being in the storm of 1.5 degree overshoot is something that I call derailment risk. So this is the idea that as the consequences worsen, it could create conditions like happened in Valencia, which draw our efforts away from tackling the causes of climate change, from reducing emissions, which will then lead to worsening consequences. We call this derailment risk because it's the idea that we could get derailed from, we could be pulled from a viable course, to think of that ship in the storm analogy, to actually being able to get out of the storm itself. And this is a critical dynamic, we think, that exists in the storm. Again, sailors experience this all the time. You could become so overwhelmed by having to deal with the impacts of the storm on the ship that you lose focus on navigating. And then you head further into the storm, further into danger, where there'll be more distractions and things could overwhelm you. And it is ultimately this that has to be at the forefront of our minds, particularly the minds of governments, the people I engage with, as we head deeper into the storm. Because it's by overcoming this risk that we will be able to rule out the very worst. And last week, I and other colleagues, I'm partly based at the University of Exeter, convened an international gathering of the top scientists and researchers on climate tipping points, on these things these parts of the environment that are getting badly disrupted and could reach a breaking point like a Jenga tower and abruptly change. And it is by managing things like derailment risk, by handling these impacts of being in the storm, that we can hope, and we can still, as far as we know, do this, avoid some of these worst impacts of these tipping points that have been mapped here by my scientific colleagues. And there are a few here in the Atlantic that look at increasing chance of being triggered. We need to make sure that we navigate away from triggering those. So this is the challenge of being in the storm. What then can we do to improve our navigational capabilities? Now, as part of our work, we did go and speak to a bunch of champion sailors, and they did confirm to us that the best strategy is to sail around a storm and not in it. But then when we pointed out that that's not been done when it comes to climate change, we then had a discussion about what capabilities we might need as societies to then be able to navigate, to then be able to avoid these tipping points, to overcome this derailment risk. And there were 5 that kept coming up from the conversations we were having with these sailors, and then we were looking at in the rest of the world. And I'm going to go through those 5 very quick, and then I'd love to have a discussion about all of this story, but particularly these capabilities and how you might already be practicing them in your particular setting. So the first of my 5 capabilities is what sailors called situational awareness, like a radar, or people on the ship being able to see what's going on around, right? When you're sailing toward a storm, situational awareness is pretty basic. You're like, there's the storm. We spotted it. We need to sail around it, right? When you're in a storm, your situational awareness has to become far more detailed, because it is the thing that will help you identify what is happening around you. It will help you identify the things that are clearly unmanageable and must be avoided. But it can also help you identify the things that might be unavoidable and will have to be better managed, like the immediate waves that are next to the boat that could distract you from being able to change the bearing to avoid the big ones that you see in the distance. And at the moment, many key institutions in society have extremely poor situational awareness. I'll give you one example. This is a table from the risk assessment, the climate change risk assessment undertaken by an English pension fund. All English pension funds, as far as we know, have similar tables that look like this. And what this is showing is that if we look down here where it says failed transition, this is the pension fund, which I will leave unnamed, looking at a scenario, risk assessing a scenario in which the world is on track, is on a course to reach 4 degrees global warming by the end of the century. Now, I think you've all probably got sufficient imagination around climate change to intuitively understand what 4 degrees means. A colleague of mine, Tim Lenton at Exeter, was talking to me the other day about this, and he said it's just extremely difficult for him as a scientist to say that societies could even be functioning under those conditions. But the pension fund thinks otherwise in its risk assessment. If you look here, it is thinking that in 40 years, so this is the mid-2060s, under that trajectory, the value of the pension fund will only be reduced by about 1%. That the impact on the pension fund will basically be a rounding error. And this is not just ludicrously bad risk assessment, and therefore presumably one of the reasons why this pension fund isn't divesting, but it's also really bad situational awareness, because we're now in the storm. If the pension fund thinks that the risks and threats that could hit it within the conditions of the storm are this benign, then it's not just going to think it doesn't need to navigate at all. It's going to get very surprised when things hit it in the storm. So things like this are common across other key institutions in society. It's starting to change, but even today we had a report published by one of the major economics agencies connected to the UK government, and it still is thinking that the impacts of climate change are not as severe as they might possibly be. You know, we're talking not even 10% of UK GDP being affected. Things like this are bad situational awareness. They mean that we've got a pretty benign idea of what it's like to be in the storm. It's like having a rubbish radar. And the way we fix that, this is quite a techie point, because these risk assessments are done by, very large institutions with lots of technical people, is to move away from an approach that focuses on trying to get a precise number, like 1%, because those numbers are often precisely wrong, and instead go for an approach that's much more about storytelling. So what this image here is showing you is a different way to do risk assessment so that it improves our situational awareness in the storm. It means doing some science, some quantifying of things, some putting of numbers on things, but then we use those numbers to build storylines. And this is an approach that's common in so many different areas, including a good example is militaries or major corporations. They don't try to, get a number of exactly what's going to happen in the future. They develop stories and they plan around those stories and they debate whether they're plausible and they come up with responses. We need a similar thing. That's what situational awareness looks like now. It's storytelling, underpinned by assessment and analysis and rigor, sure, but so many things are now possible that we need different stories to explore them, which will give us a better idea of what could happen and what means it could be less surprised and therefore more able to continue navigating. So that's my first capability. My second is resilience. This is very intuitive. You need a stronger boat when you're in a storm, right? And what that's going to mean for societies is that we are going to have this movement towards more adaptation. It's not yet happened, right? The UK government's official climate advisors, the Climate Change Committee, have for a long time said that the governments of all stripes have been a very long way behind on ensuring that we are resilient even to current levels of climate change, let alone what's coming in the future. So that, what we could describe as adaptation gap, has got to be closed. But there is a way to close it that is appropriate for what comes next. Now, a part of it is building more flood barriers like this, right? Great. We do need to build all the flood barriers that weren't necessarily getting built under the Conservative government in the past. But that's not going to be enough. So and I anticipate this happening, there is a greater movement, political movement towards talking about adaptation. Then there needs to be a political struggle over what adaptation means. And one version of that is that it's adaptation that just looks like this. This is very important. Making all our infrastructure more rugged, very important. But in that political struggle, a wider definition of adaptation has got to be won through, in my view. And it's one that isn't just about responding and preparing to the impacts of climate change to improving infrastructure, like you can see on the left of this image here. It's in addition doing those other things that you can see on the right-hand side, right? It's not for a lack of flood barriers that mean a low-income community with poor quality housing and a lack of educational opportunities and so on is going to be vulnerable to what comes next, right? It's because of all of those things as well. And so we got to make sure that as there is probably a knee-jerk towards adaptation politically, that it is understood not as just building flood barriers around high-value properties, that it's actually about getting to the root causes of why people might be vulnerable to those worsening impacts of climate change. So adaptation isn't just flood barriers, it is things like alternative lifestyles and employment and dealing with poverty, because it's those really fundamentally that make us vulnerable in what comes next. It's really dealing with those that will make our figurative boat much hardier in the face of the storm. Which brings me to my third capability. You've got to be able to move fast in a storm as well, and get out as quickly as you can so you don't head further into the danger, right? And I'm going to connect this idea of speed to this idea of adaptation, to this idea of making the boat stronger. Because we can't anymore be in this situation where, as is often the case with climate change policy, adapting and making things stronger is seen as mutually exclusive to reducing emissions. It's like, we've got to reduce emissions, we'll deal with the root cause of the problem, and any talking about adapting is almost like giving up, right? And as I've just been saying, I think more people will start to talk about adapting, but the two have got to come together. We have got to be doing the things that make us safer in the moment to the dangers of climate change and ensure that they, at the same time, are reducing emissions. And there's a good example, we got a demonstrator of this, and it's this house in LA. This house was on a street that was completely destroyed in the fires last year, but one house survived, and it was this one. And it was a house that was built using passive house standards, right? So this is this method of ensuring that houses are much more energy efficient. The house is sealed, physically sealed. It means you can control the temperature within it, right? Many of you probably know about this. And from my understanding, that sealing of the house, making it more airtight, meant that the cinders from the fire couldn't get in under the roof. It's often how fire is then transmitted building to building to building very quickly in these super fires that climate change has now made possible. So this is a building, think about this. This is a building that before the fires had less energy use and therefore emissions, right? Because it managed its temperature much better. That's the core point of a passive house, right? So lower emissions, lower energy use, which also meant that those living in the house saved on their bills. And then when the fires came, it didn't burn down. And there's this amazing video of the family who lived in this, talking about how they built it because of this win-win-win, that it would reduce their bills, mean less emissions, and they weren't necessarily anticipated at the time, but made it more resilient as well. Now, this family was well off and built this house, but there are ways of doing this that aren't just for wealthy people as well. But more even than that, this is more than just houses, right? This is we could think of this house as representing a design principle for society at large, for ensuring that the things that can help us be more resilient are simultaneously the things that can help us reduce emissions. Or to put that in the climate jargon, that adaptation can be an enabler of mitigation at the same time, right? And I think that basically we are now in a situation politically where there is a race on. There is a race to be the most, to convincingly claim that you can make people safer. And there are people like Santiago Abascal, like Trump, like others as well in this country, who are making effectively claims that they can make you safer in a world that is becoming more chaotic. In that political race, the people who've got to win it, though, have got to be the people who can, yes, make people feel safe in the moment, but at the same time ensure that those are the same things that reduce emissions, because ultimately that's what's going to keep us all safe in the medium to longer term. So that's my next capability, that we've got to make sure that our speed is connected to adaptation, that we can do these two things together. The fourth is that we need stories to make sense of all this, and we don't necessarily have them. This is the best image I could find, by the way, of people talking stories on a ship. And I'm not even sure that that's what's happening. But we don't have necessarily the stories to make sense of this new reality. You need that on a ship, right? If you thought you were going to sail round, but then you're in it, it is a completely discombobulated experience. And you can understand why you would slip into two types of binary extreme that we also see with the climate crisis, right? That either you're going to very quickly be saved. The ship, is the equivalent of it just suddenly turning around and getting out of the storm. And our equivalent for climate change is that sort of massive global scale technologies will effectively mean that there's imminent salvation. But that is implausible. Some of those technologies are going to have to be used, but they're not going to save us. They're not going to get us out of the storm straight away. And then the other extreme that you could fall into is one of that we're inevitably damned. That, like a ship in a storm, because you've entered it, it means that it's game over. And that isn't plausible either. There's nothing out there in the evidence that shows that we're guaranteed for societies to collapse or things like this. Things will get worse, and it will probably feel like that might be guaranteed. But these binary extremes of inevitable salvation of imminent salvation or inevitable damnation, these are not, at the end of the day, useful motivators. They are not when you're a crew in a storm, and they're absolutely not with our societies now. But we haven't yet got the mainstream stories that can do that for us. And that's what we will need to develop. And we will need that to filter through to politics. Ignore the guy in the middle here. But there was a time during the pandemic where we did similarly have stories about navigating through things. We often told them at community level far better than we did at national level. But we will need equivalent stories for what comes next. Right now, they may not make sense, right? Because particularly in countries like Britain, the experience of being in the storm might to some people seem far away. But as it becomes closer and closer, these stories will make sense. So to cultivate them now is to ensure that when that time does come, and it will, that those stories can become very powerful very quick. And that pre-positioning of our storytelling is absolutely critical to what comes next. And then the fifth and final one that I seem to have dropped the slide from here is leadership. We need a leadership that expresses all of what I've been talking about. And we need that at the grassroots level, all the way to the national level and beyond. And we don't necessarily have that. And like I said at the beginning of this story, I do think, and I have admired and been inspired by how some of that leadership is emerging at grassroots level through campaigning. It is through the confrontational nature of campaigning that I have felt more able to talk about some of the things I'm talking about here to people in positions of power. But that leadership will have to become very widely spread. In a similar way, again, why I've still got this image up, that we saw in the pandemic. It was leadership from the community level through things like mutual aid societies that helped people in those darkest moments and helped us nationally, including the government, including the massive institutions like the NHS, to be able to navigate through the storm of COVID. And we'll need that leadership now in the same way that we need leadership when you're a ship in a storm. So those are my 5 capabilities that I think we now need as we head into the literal and figurative storm of 1.5 degree overshoot. And I would be very interested to see what you guys thought of this story and how you might be playing around with some of these capabilities yourself in your own setting. So thanks for listening, and I really look forward to some of our conversation now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurie. That is absolutely incredible. Really, really good presentation there. I love the analogy about the boats going through the storm, and then that is what we are headed into, the storms of climate change, and we're all on what I used to call planet the ship of planet Earth, and we're all sailing on it together. So how do we work together to get through those storms? And there's a lot of people turn up here tonight from a lot of different groups and organisations, and how do we shift the narrative and tell the stories about, making it through the storm to the more sustainable futures? The Climate Emergency Centre Network is a kind of, it's building resilient spaces. It grew very fast after lockdown. Mutual aid societies popped up, and I think a lot of people wanted to cooperate and have space to meet. And just shortly after lockdown, there was, the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's now 32 of them using vacant shops on the high street and raising awareness about solutions and creating alliances of local groups, and hopefully getting out to the general public that doesn't always see the other green issues and things. So we need to build those ships of hope and solutions on the high street.
Thank you, everyone, for everything you do. And I must say that there are some of us who operate in different spaces, but many of us are listening and being hugely inspired. And also, I have seen on our high street in Exeter various shops popping up that give us an opportunity, climate emergency centres, and I will definitely be popping in the next time I see one as well after having had this chat. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Laurie. Keep networking wherever you are, folks. That's really appreciated. And
Thank
let's
you.
share stories. We need to be real about the doom, but also about these solutions and what we can do about these things. Thanks so much, Laurie. Respect.
My pleasure. Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Take care.